They charted the stars and built cities of gods, only to mysteriously collapse into ruin. But the story of the lost Maya is a lie. Their civilization never truly ended. Deep within the Central American rainforest, colossal stone structures emerge from the morning mist. For over a millennium, these ancient monuments have stood as silent sentinels over the jungle, bearing witness to one of the greatest chapters in human history. The legacy of the pyramid builders is carried on today by 6 million people who still speak their ancestral languages. They are the living inheritors of a civilization whose accomplishments predated those of Europe by 1,000 years. Their calculation of the solar year's length was so precise it stands up against our own modern measurements. Long before the rest of the world, they independently developed the mathematical idea of zero. While future European capitals like London and Paris were still little more than muddy villages, this civilization was building sprawling metropolises. Even their warfare was sophisticated, with major campaigns timed to the celestial movements of the planet Venus. Their divine rulers claimed the ability to communicate directly with the gods, presiding over an empire that covered a territory larger than France. This domain stretched all the way from Mexico to Honduras, commanding millions of people. And then, for more than a century, it seemed as if they had simply vanished. The prevailing story became one of a mysterious lost civilization, its great cities swallowed by the jungle and its secrets gone forever. But now, the silent stones are revealing their stories. The intricate hieroglyphs have finally yielded their secrets, and what has emerged is not a tale of a people who were lost, but the grand epic of a culture that never truly disappeared. This is humanity's most astonishing journey through time, a 9,000-year saga of breathtaking innovation, catastrophe, and survival. It's a narrative that begins with the first kernels of wild corn and soars to the construction of great pyramids that challenged the heavens. We will meet divine kings who believed they commanded the stars and discover modern communities fighting to safeguard their ancestral wisdom. This account is filled with environmental collapse and renewal, astounding political genius and tragic human error, and scientific breakthroughs that defied the limits of their age. It is a story of cultural endurance against impossible odds. More than anything, it is proof that time can be conquered, not with empires or technology, but through the simple, powerful act of refusing to let go. The calendar turns, the ceremony continues, and the story flows onward. To find the true beginnings of this story, we must look past the towering pyramids of Tikal and the stone-carved legacies of kings. The genesis of this civilization wasn't found in an empire, but in a humble grain, corn. It all started around 7,000 BC, when nomadic hunters in the highlands of Mexico and Guatemala began a remarkable process. They took a wild, scraggly grass called teosinte, and through generations of careful selection, began its slow journey to becoming the maize we know today. This act wasn't merely the dawn of agriculture, it was the very cornerstone upon which their civilization would be built. Previously, the region's peoples had lived a nomadic existence, moving in small bands that followed the seasons, gathering wild avocados and hunting deer. A revolutionary shift occurred as each successive generation improved the yields from their maize crops. Suddenly, people could stay in one place. This led to the establishment of the first permanent villages, which began to dot the landscape by 2000 BC. These were not yet the grand cities that would later define the civilization, but rather humble settlements of thatched-roof houses clustered around cultivated fields. The inhabitants of these villages spoke the earliest forms of a language group that would eventually diversify into more than 30 distinct tongues, from Yucatec in the north to Kayich in the south. However, these early settlers were not developing in a vacuum. To their west, the Olmec civilization was flourishing, famous for its colossal stone heads and its vast trade networks. Interactions with Olmec merchants brought not only goods like jade and obsidian, but also groundbreaking concepts about the cosmos, ritual, and kingship. From the Olmec, these proto-Maya peoples adopted their initial writing symbols, the idea of divine leadership, and the tradition of raising carved stone monuments to mark significant moments. They also integrated the Olmec calendar and their techniques for aligning ceremonial centers with celestial patterns. Yet this was no simple imitation. They took these ideas, refined them, and in time would eclipse their mentors. Evidence of this evolution can be seen by 1000 BC, as sites like Nak began to rise from the rainforests of northern Guatemala. These were no longer simple villages. They were true urban centers boasting monumental architecture. At Nak, enormous platforms, some soaring to 45 feet, were constructed, an undertaking that demanded sophisticated organization and a workforce of thousands. This represents a critical turning point where the civilization began to master its jungle environment, instead of merely surviving within it. This leap from village life to urban living introduced complex new problems. The need to organize thousands of inhabitants, manage food supplies, and uphold social order spurred the development of solutions that would define them for centuries: the written word, intricate ritual calendars, and hereditary leadership. The culmination of these advancements is powerfully demonstrated at El Mirador, which by 600 BC had grown even grander. Its La Danta complex, a staggering structure sprawling over 18 acres and climbing 230 feet from the jungle floor, stands today as one of the largest pyramids ever constructed in the Americas. Such a feat was far more than just impressive engineering. It was a declaration of power, a tangible link to the divine, and undeniable proof that this ancient culture had arrived as a major civilization. None of these early cities developed in isolation. A web of trade routes connected the entire region, facilitating the flow of ideas as well as goods. Obsidian from the Guatemalan highlands found its way to lowland cities, while precious jade from the Motagua Valley was transported hundreds of miles. Revered as the food of the gods, cacao beans served as both nourishment and currency, setting up economic patterns that would endure right up to the Spanish arrival. It was also during this foundational era that a sophisticated grasp of astronomy and time began to take shape. The earliest carved stone monuments, known as stelae, recorded dates through a complex system of multiple, interlocking calendars. This practice went beyond simple record-keeping. It was a method for comprehending humanity's role within the cosmic order. For these ancient astronomers, time was cyclical. The past held clues to the future, and specific days were believed to be more favorable for undertaking important tasks. But their ingenuity shone brightest in their agricultural solutions, which conquered even the most difficult landscapes. To manage the wetlands, they engineered raised fields that offered both excellent drainage and rich earth for planting. Within the jungles, a complex system of forest stewardship was put into practice, where valuable trees were kept standing even as other areas were cleared for farming. An equally impressive feat was their development of rainwater capture and storage systems, which laid the groundwork for the massive populations that would follow. This incredible adaptability is mirrored in the explosion of different languages from this time. In the highlands, new words were born to describe mountain farming techniques and volcanic soils. Meanwhile, the languages of the lowlands developed an extensive vocabulary for the intricacies of jungle life and water control. Rather than pointing to fragmentation, this linguistic variety was a testament to their skill in tailoring their culture to diverse settings while holding onto their fundamental beliefs and traditions. Yet a crisis was looming, and by 100 BC it struck many of these pioneering centers. El Mirador, which had been the most magnificent city in all of Mesoamerica, found itself almost completely deserted. We still debate the exact reasons for this collapse. It could have been a severe drought, widespread social unrest, or the failure of crucial trade routes. Regardless of the trigger, this initial era of city building in the region came to a sudden and dramatic close. This wasn't a final chapter, however. The immense knowledge, cultural practices, and clever innovations of these first cities were not lost forever. Instead, they scattered, transformed, and would ultimately reappear in new and powerful ways. The downfall of El Mirador and other major sites actually cleared the way for new powers to emerge, preparing the ground for the most glorious era the region would ever know. All the core concepts developed in these early centuries, from divine rulers and grand-scale building to advanced farming, intricate writing, and meticulous astronomy, were like seeds waiting for the right moment. These seeds would soon blossom during the Classic period. The groundwork was complete. The time for constructing the Great Pyramids had arrived. While the jungle reclaimed El Mirador, the silence was only temporary. A few generations later, new cities started to push up through the jungle canopy, each grander in scope than those that came before. It was as if the fall of the first great powers had broadcast their wisdom across the land, and incredible new growth sprouted wherever it took root. A surge of fresh energy swept across the lowlands around 300 BC, as construction began again with incredible intensity. At Camanaljuyu, a center tucked away in Guatemala's volcanic highlands, enormous mounds made of earth began to dominate the valley. The builders at these new sites broke from tradition. Instead of working mainly with stone, they sculpted their monuments from clay and volcanic ash, forming platforms designed to last for thousands of years. The sheer size of these undertakings is difficult to comprehend. A single platform could involve shifting hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of dirt, with every bit transported in baskets on human backs. This immense task, however, was more than just physical toil. It represented a massive, coordinated project that required advanced planning, a clear chain of command, and a strong guiding vision. A specific person had to direct the workforce, manage the complex timelines, and hold the blueprint for the finished structure in their mind. That person was solidifying their role as a new type of ruler, the divine king. What these new leaders claimed was truly groundbreaking, a direct line to the gods themselves. They positioned themselves not just as tribal chiefs or military commanders, but as holy conduits capable of translating divine purpose into real-world results. This new authority was broadcast through art, as stone monuments started to feature carved portraits of rulers adorned with intricate headdresses. These figures were draped in symbols of the supernatural, advertising their connection to the cosmos. Creating these royal portraits was a revolutionary step in artistic and political expression. It was the first time that specific, individual leaders were being captured in stone, their legacy and accomplishments preserved for all time. Alongside these images, the first hieroglyphic inscriptions, though simple by later standards, started to show up on stone pillars and the faces of buildings. Far from being simple ornamentation, these texts were public records that announced military triumphs, documented celestial events, and cemented a ruler's right to govern by tracing their lineage back to the gods. The development of writing systems accelerated dramatically during this era. While drawing significant inspiration from older Olmec traditions, these systems began to take on distinct local characteristics. The scribes carving these first texts were achieving something far more profound than simple communication. A new connection between the past, the present, and the future was being forged. The history of the ruling dynasty could now be permanently recorded, referenced when needed, and even altered to support the political goals of the king. This growing complexity was also mirrored in religious construction. Grand ceremonial centers began to take shape, often with several pyramids situated around large open plazas that were perfect for holding public rituals and massive assemblies. A clear sign of their advancing astronomical knowledge was the appearance of E-groups, a specific layout of 3 buildings used to precisely follow the sun's path over the course of a year. These new architectural designs were more than just about looking good. They were a direct consequence of deep shifts in the organization of society. To undertake such colossal building projects, a society needed a surplus of food, a class of skilled artisans, and sophisticated administrative structures to manage it all. Small settlements were evolving into true cities, complete with defined social hierarchies, specialized jobs for their citizens, and a powerful central government. Trade networks began to expand, connecting these rising centers. Flowing from these burgeoning connections, commerce during this era exploded, linking the highlands and lowlands in ways never seen before. Obsidian, sourced from volcanic heights, found its way hundreds of miles into lowland settlements, while precious jade from the Motagua Valley journeyed to highland cities. Salt harvested from the coast became a prized resource deep in the interior, just as cacao beans from jungle groves were enjoyed in mountain communities. This was far from simple bartering. These were organized commercial networks that wove disparate regions together into a cohesive economic fabric. A central element of city design in this period was the ball court. These distinctive, eye-shaped arenas were more than just sports venues. They were sacred stages for ritual competitions that played out cosmic dramas. The game itself symbolized the timeless battle between life and death, or order and chaos. Players took on mythological roles, reenacting legendary conflicts that were believed to secure the world's very existence. As cities grew, regional identities sharpened, with different areas cultivating unique architectural forms and cultural traditions. In the highlands, centers like Kaminaljuyu preferred building with earth and volcanic stone. Meanwhile, lowland cities continued their mastery of limestone construction. Communities along the coast developed novel ways of life suited to a maritime world, while those inland perfected forest agriculture and water control. The rise of specialized crafts also introduced new layers to society, breaking down the simple two-tiered model of farmers and rulers. Highly skilled artisans who worked with jade, obsidian, pottery, and textiles began to form their own professional communities. They established distinct neighborhoods, workshops, and trade connections, producing not just everyday tools, but also the luxury items that signified elite power and fueled long-distance commerce. Linguistic diversity also blossomed. As different groups adapted to their surroundings, their languages evolved, creating specialized words for local environments and activities. Highland dialects adopted terms for volcanic events and mountain farming, while lowland languages developed a rich vocabulary for rainforest ecology and hydraulic engineering. This wealth of language mirrored the increasingly intricate relationships people had with their varied landscapes. To feed growing populations, agricultural innovations surged forward. In wetland regions, raised field systems became more common, offering a brilliant solution for both drainage and soil enrichment. Across the highlands, farmers carved terraces into steep mountainsides, a technique that enabled cultivation on slopes while preventing soil erosion. Forest gardening grew more advanced, with communities maintaining complex multi-crop systems that produced food while mimicking the resilience of natural ecosystems. Managing water became an essential technology. In cities like Tikal, inhabitants engineered incredible networks of reservoirs, canals, and dams. These systems were designed to capture and hold rainwater during the wet season, providing a vital resource during the dry months. Such hydraulic projects demanded a level of coordinated labor and technical skill equal to that of their most massive temples. Formal calendar systems were refined to an extraordinary degree of accuracy during this time. A number of interlocking cycles, based on the Sun, Moon, and Venus, were woven together into comprehensive frameworks that could track time over immense periods. These calendars were not just for scheduling farming. They were seen as cosmological instruments that unlocked the fundamental patterns of the universe. Political structures also grew more elaborate as powerful cities extended their reach over neighboring territories. Smaller towns started to recognize the authority of larger ones, forming the first hierarchical relationships that would define later eras. These were not always forged through conquest. Many were voluntary alliances cemented by trade agreements, strategic marriages, and shared religious duties. Yet, as this incredible cultural flowering approached its zenith around 100 AD, the first signs of trouble emerged. Construction of monuments slowed in many places, while some cities showed evidence of warfare or sudden abandonment. The reasons are still debated by scholars, with theories pointing to prolonged drought, internal political strife, or the collapse of the very trade networks that city life depended on. The subsequent decline was swift and widespread. Within a few generations, major centers across the region fell silent, their grand plazas and workshops deserted. But this was not a final ending like the earlier fall of El Mirador. The cultural foundations laid during the Preclassic period, divine kingship, monumental architecture, sophisticated writing, and cosmic calendars, were too robust to vanish completely. In the ruins of the Old World, new ideas were already taking hold, setting the stage for an even more spectacular reemergence. The greatest chapter in the story of ancient America was about to begin. Around the middle of the 3rd century, without a single grand ceremony or obvious cosmic event, one of history's most stunning transformations took place. Seemingly overnight, scattered city-states across Mesoamerica ignited, blossoming into the most advanced civilization the Americas had ever known. From the Petane rainforests to the volcanic highlands, ambitious new leaders began to etch their legacies into stone. Monuments rose from the jungle, recording dates with a mathematical precision that European science would not achieve for another 1,000 years. This was more than the construction of new cities. It was the birth of a cosmic worldview that would redefine the human relationship with time, space, and the gods. Tikal was the first great superpower of this new age, rising from the forest like a man-made mountain range. Its skyline of towering pyramids announced the arrival of something new. Temple IV, finished in the 8th century, soared 230 feet above the canopy, taller than a 20-story building and a landmark for miles. But Tikal's greatest innovation was political, not architectural. It was here that the concept of divine kingship was perfected, with rulers who claimed they were direct descendants of the gods, able to communicate with the supernatural realm. The kings of Tikal were not just men in elaborate costumes. They were seen as living bridges between the heavens and the earth, their every action resonating with cosmic meaning. When the ruler Jaso Chankayawil dedicated a new temple late in the 7th century, he wasn't just unveiling a building. He was theatrically reenacting the moment the gods first separated the sky from the sea at the dawn of creation. Royal ceremonies became grand public performances of creation myths, starring the king as a creator god before thousands of spectators. However, Tikal's supremacy did not go uncontested. 200 miles to the north, the city of Calakmul was building its own empire, matching Tikal's ambition with superior political skill. Calakmul's leaders understood a key principle in a world of rival cities. Power came not just from strength, but from connections. Using a shrewd combination of marriages, alliances, and targeted warfare, Calakmul wove a vast web of influence that eventually covered half the Maya world. For 3 centuries, the intense rivalry between these two superpowers shaped the politics of the classic period. This was no simple war for territory. It was an ideological conflict fought with astronomical precision. Battles were timed to align with the cycles of Venus, allowing rulers to claim celestial approval for their military actions. Victory monuments documented not just battlefield successes, but also the cosmic alignments that served as proof of divine support. When their armies marched, they carried not only weapons, but the authority of the stars. Nestled in the highlands of Honduras, the city of Copan pursued greatness through a different strategy. Instead of military might, its rulers focused on intellectual and artistic supremacy. The city's famous hieroglyphic stairway, completed in the mid-8th century, is the longest known text from the ancient Americas, containing over 2,500 individual glyphs. This was no mere decoration. It was a detailed dynastic history that traced the royal bloodline back 15 generations to the city's founder, Yaks Kayuk Mo. The scribes behind these texts were elevating writing to an art form of incredible complexity. Hieroglyphic inscriptions could now convey not just names and dates, but also intricate historical accounts, abstract religious ideas, and even sophisticated political propaganda. The very same event would often be described in different ways on monuments in allied versus enemy cities, proving that spin was alive and well in the ancient world. In this ancient world, warfare wasn't announced by the clash of weapons or the charge of soldiers, but by the precise calculations of astronomers. A colossal rivalry, the largest Mesoamerica had ever seen, pitted a southern superpower against its northern competitor. Rulers launched their invasions based on the movements of the planet Venus, arguing that triumph was granted by the gods, not earned by the mightiest force. For 300 years, this epic struggle would dominate regional politics, forging scattered cities into sprawling networks of allegiances and subject states. The conflict was far more than a simple land grab. It was a battle for cosmic validation. Across a massive theater of war, from the Caribbean shores to the highlands of the Pacific, the two powers clashed. The ultimate reward wasn't territory or treasure, but the mandate to declare divine rule over the most advanced civilization in the Americas. It was the Northern Kingdom that made the initial move. They knew that in a culture of god-kings, public image was just as critical as battlefield prowess. Employing shrewd diplomacy and calculated political marriages, this aspiring empire started to construct a vast network of alliances, gradually bringing dozens of smaller cities into its orbit. Princesses were married off to faraway courts, and their dowries were accompanied by invaluable intelligence-gathering operations that would be vital for later military action. They also re-engineered tribute requirements to make other cities economically reliant on them, and they coordinated religious rituals to project an image of shared celestial destiny. By the time northern armies pushed south in the 6th century, their arrival was framed not as an invasion, but as a mission of liberation. A masterfully executed propaganda effort portrayed the Southern Empire as a decadent regime that had fallen out of favor with the gods. In contrast, the Northern Kingdom positioned itself as the chosen agent of cosmic order, destined to restore balance. Northern operatives skillfully took advantage of local discontent, offering promises of reduced tribute payments and increased self-governance to influential regional leaders. The information war was every bit as advanced as the military one. The victory monuments raised after a successful campaign did more than just list defeated enemies. They reframed the battles as cosmic reenactments, with human kings playing key roles in heavenly dramas. The appearance of the morning star was the celestial signal to begin an attack. A solar eclipse darkening the sky served as divine proof of a victorious king's authority. In this environment, astronomy was a tool of the state, and the sacred calendars were transformed into weapons for establishing legitimacy. Pulling off such a widespread propaganda, Blitz demanded immense coordination between numerous cities and territories. Teams of scribes made sure that the carved monuments in every allied city presented a unified account of recent military successes. Meanwhile, court artisans created a standard set of symbols and images that could be easily recognized, even by people who spoke different languages. This shared symbolic vocabulary, displayed on the Northern Kingdom's monuments, was mirrored in client states hundreds of miles away. The result was a consistent visual story of divine power that strengthened the Northern Empire's argument for absolute rule over the known world. When the great jungle capital finally suffered its first major defeat, the news sent shockwaves throughout the entire Maya region. In the mid-6th century, the Northern Kingdom's forces successfully captured the city in a climactic campaign. This climactic campaign was dubbed a Star War by those who lived it, a conflict meticulously scheduled according to planetary movements and sanctioned by divine authority. The Southern Kingdom suffered a humiliation so profound that its monuments ceased recording history for more than a century, a period of silence that archaeologists now call the hiatus. The Northern Conquest was itself an exercise in masterful, coordinated strategy. Rather than laying a direct siege to the southern capital, Northern forces began by systematically unraveling its network of allegiances. They captured or swayed secondary cities using a careful blend of military might and diplomatic promises. The severing of crucial trade routes choked off the supply of tribute and luxury items that the southern court relied upon. By the time the northern armies finally arrived at the capital's gates, its leadership was completely isolated, their one-time allies either conquered or turned against them. In the wake of their triumph, the Northern Kingdom showcased a sophisticated approach to imperial governance. Instead of razing the conquered city, the victors established a puppet dynasty, leaving the existing administrative machinery largely intact. Local nobles who cooperated were allowed to retain their status, whereas those who resisted found themselves replaced by loyal northern appointees. This strategy of selective integration proved effective in cementing control while keeping further opposition to a minimum. However, this crushing defeat sowed the seeds of a future reckoning. For generations, the exiled southern royal family meticulously planned their comeback, forging new alliances and awaiting the perfect celestial alignment to reclaim their birthright. When that moment finally dawned in the late 7th century, the resulting act of vengeance would permanently alter the political map of Mesoamerica. The very idea of a star war highlights the advanced celestial knowledge that was woven into the fabric of ancient governance. The morning star, with its highly predictable cycle of appearance and disappearance, served as a divine timetable that dictated when to wage war. Leaders capable of forecasting these cosmic cycles gained an immense strategic edge, as they appeared to command the very forces that decided life and death. Achieving this required a level of mathematical precision that was on par with any in the ancient world. Royal astronomers meticulously tracked not only the brilliant planet Venus, but also the retrograde motions of Mars, lunar eclipses, and the intricate workings of their calendrical systems. Warfare evolved into a science where battlefield tactics merged with celestial mechanics, resulting in a form of statecraft that would not be seen again until the European Renaissance. At the same time, strategic marriages bound the rival networks together in increasingly intricate patterns. Royal women were far more than simple bargaining chips in these diplomatic games. They were active participants who facilitated communication between their new homes and their kingdoms of birth. A prime example is Princess Ninth Skull of the Southern Power, who, after marrying into the royal line of Yak Small, did not forget her allegiance to her father. She acted as a vital intelligence source, passing along information on northern strategies while shaping the decisions of her adopted city. These matrimonial ties spun complex webs of duty and ambition that frequently outlived the military campaigns that created them. The children born from these unions often possessed legitimate claims to more than one throne, sparking succession crises that could throw entire regions into turmoil. It was common for royal women to act as regents for their young sons, giving them immense authority during these unstable periods. The most adept female rulers became masters at navigating these complicated kinship networks, skillfully playing factions against one another as they built up their own independent sources of power. The diplomatic customs surrounding these marriages point to the refined courtly culture that flourished during the Classic period. Wedding festivities could extend for weeks, involving extravagant exchanges of gifts that redistributed fortunes across great distances. The marriage contracts themselves were highly detailed, outlining not only dynastic succession, but also specific terms on trade rights, military duties, and religious observances. The negotiation of these terms was a painstaking process that could take years, with envoys traveling between courts to finalize an agreement. This system of vassal states introduced an unprecedented level of diplomatic complexity. Smaller cities were often caught in the crossfire between the competing superpowers, compelled to choose a side in struggles that could spell their doom. The city of Deux Pilas, situated strategically between the two giants, famously tried to play both sides against the middle, paying tribute to the Northern Empire while continuing its trade with the Southern Kingdom. This high-stakes gamble would ultimately seal the city's fate, leading to its spectacular ruin. The tributary system that defined these relationships was far more nuanced than simple taxation. Vassal cities were obligated to supply not just goods but also specialized services, such as military contingents for campaigns, skilled artisans for royal construction projects, and scribes for administrative duties. In exchange, they received military protection, entry into vast trade networks, and a role in the prestigious religious ceremonies that validated their elite status. The shrewdest vassal lords learned to make themselves essential to their overlords, cultivating expertise in fields like astronomy, luxury craftwork, or military engineering to ensure their continued autonomy. Regional balances of power were in constant flux as smaller states vied to enhance their standing within these hierarchies. A city that started as a tribute-paying vassal could, over time, gather enough resources and influence to mount a direct challenge to its masters. Conversely, once mighty regional powers could be reduced to vassalage following military losses or internal succession struggles. This perpetual state of motion created pathways for ambitious leaders, but also fostered a deep-seated instability that would ultimately help bring the entire system down. Alliance networks were constantly shifting as rulers died, successions were contested, and the tides of war turned. A city serving as a loyal northern ally in one generation could become a southern vassal in the next, based on marriage ties, battlefield outcomes, or sheer opportunism. These realignments produced a dynamic political landscape where no alliance was truly permanent and every relationship was subject to constant renegotiation. The Southern powers' resurgence was the result of meticulous preparation that spanned several decades. The Southern king, Jasochan Kyawiel I, did more than just assemble an army. He rebuilt his city's capacity for stellar observation, ordered new monuments to signal divine support, and carefully nurtured alliances with the northern kingdom's own disgruntled vassals. When he finally launched his counterattack near the end of the 7th century, his victory was as much a triumph of intellect as it was of military force. The decisive battle that reinstated Southern supremacy was timed to coincide with a rare astronomical conjunction, an event that happened only once every few hundred years. The Northern forces, completely unprepared for an assault during what their own astronomers deemed an unlucky period, were dealt a catastrophic blow. Their king was captured, and by all accounts, sacrificed in the central plaza of the jungle capital, bringing an end to the Northern Empire's century of dominance. Monuments erected after this victory reveal the sophisticated propaganda each side used. Southern scribes cast the conflict in epic, cosmic terms, proclaiming that their king had vanquished not only mortal foes, but also the supernatural forces of chaos. Captured northern weapons and regalia were put on public display as proof that the gods themselves had changed their allegiance, abandoning the northern kingdom to favor the southern cause. The consequences of this dramatic reversal of fortune rippled across the entire region. Cities that had loyally served the Northern Empire for generations were now desperately scrambling to profess their allegiance to the new dominant power. Tribute obligations were reversed overnight, trade routes were rerouted, and royal marriages were hastily arranged to reflect the new political order. Yet the very success of these superpower struggles inadvertently paved the way for widespread instability. The Pitaxbaton region, caught between the shifting alliances, plunged into chaos as rival dynasties battled for supremacy. Duz Pilas, once a formidable regional player, was violently obliterated during the 8th century, its monuments smashed to pieces and its people forced to flee. The fall of this city demonstrates how the overarching rivalry destabilized smaller centers, as the great powers urged their vassals into proxy wars that spiraled out of control. The very system that had generated unparalleled prosperity was now creating the conditions for its own collapse. As the intensity of warfare grew throughout the 8th century, royal courts became increasingly militarized. Palaces that once boasted grand reception halls and scribal academies were now retrofitted with defensive walls and watchtowers. The art of this era depicts rulers in battle attire instead of ceremonial robes, a stark reflection of the new reality of unending military threat. Mass migrations picked up speed as populations fled war-torn areas in search of safer lands. Archaeological findings confirm the swift abandonment of settlements in contested border zones, alongside a proliferation of fortified hilltop communities in what were once peaceful territories. The sophisticated urban civilization of the Classic period was shattering into isolated, defensive pockets, separated by increasingly lawless lands. The breakdown of the long-distance trade networks that had tied them all together was having a severe economic impact. With the vital commercial arteries now severed, the economic lifeblood of the Maya world stopped flowing. Goods that had once defined an interconnected civilization suddenly vanished from local markets. Precious obsidian from the Guatemalan highlands became a rarity in lowland cities, and products from the coast couldn't find their way to inland communities anymore. The very prosperity of the Classic period, built on these extensive trade relationships, was being dismantled by relentless instability and warfare. This economic turmoil fanned the flames of political chaos. Throughout the Maya lowlands, elite families began turning on each other with increasing ferocity. The traditional pillars that held up a king's authority, claims of divine ancestry, mastery of cosmic knowledge, and glorious military victories, were crumbling. Rulers who could no longer promise security or deliver prosperity found themselves vulnerable. They faced constant threats from all sides: ambitious cousins, resentful nobles, and powerful warlords who offered a more compelling vision of strength and stability. You can see this new, brutal reality carved directly into the stone of the cities themselves. Urban planning underwent a radical transformation, shifting from open ceremonial centers to heavily defended strongholds. Places like Aguetka were entirely rebuilt as fortresses, complete with towering walls, chokepoint entrances, and strategic positions to control any approach. These were not just temporary measures. They were permanent redesigns of society, reflecting an era where endemic conflict was the new normal. Ironically, the very system of grand, theatrical warfare that had defined the peak of Maya power was now causing its undoing. The Star Wars, conflicts between rival superpowers, had created a political climate so volatile and resource-intensive that it was eating itself alive. This escalating cycle of violence was pushing the entire classic Maya world toward a catastrophic system failure. Yet, the legacy of these cosmic struggles was complex. The astronomical expertise honed for warfare would continue to shape decision-making for centuries. The powerful propaganda methods developed by kings to justify these campaigns would set the standard for royal legitimacy long after they were gone. And crucially, the alliances and rivalries forged in this crucible would lay the groundwork for the new powers that would rise from the rubble. Looking back, we can see this period not just as an ending, but as a profound transformation of an entire worldview. These celestial campaigns represented the peak of divine kingship, an ideology where rulers claimed to channel the power of the cosmos. It was also its greatest failure. The kings had built a system too complex, too violent, and too fragile to last. The stars that had once seemingly guided their path to victory would now bear witness to their spectacular collapse. The very term, Star Wars, shows just how deeply astronomical belief was woven into military thinking. These weren't simply battles fought on lucky days. They were seen as earthly enactments of cosmic dramas. When a king declared a star war, he was asserting that his fight on the ground mirrored a supernatural struggle in the heavens, with the movements of planets serving as both the battlefield and a divine scoreboard. A victory wasn't just a military triumph. It was proof that the universe itself sided with the winner, validating his claim to divine power. But the first true signs of this collapse weren't in crumbling monuments or broken alliances. They were hidden in the soil. Beneath the grand plazas, archaeological layers reveal a story of creeping environmental disaster. What started as small-scale agricultural challenges would soon spiral into a full-blown catastrophe, one that would silence the bustling jungle cities and erase entire royal dynasties from history. The problem began with the trees. As populations boomed during the late 8th century, the demand for farmland exploded, leading to accelerated forest clearance. Around the major cities, huge swaths of jungle were stripped bare. This massive deforestation wrecked local water cycles and exposed the thin tropical soil to severe erosion. The very agricultural success that had fed millions was now methodically destroying the environmental foundation of their society. Soil samples from this time show a dramatic spike in sediment washed into lakes and rivers, a clear footprint of widespread ecological ruin. This deforestation kicked off a vicious cycle that made every other environmental problem worse. Without the jungle canopy to hold in moisture, the annual dry seasons became harsher and longer. In contrast, the wet seasons brought flash floods that swept away topsoil and devastated farmland. The sophisticated water management systems, the reservoirs and canals built over centuries, started to fail. Watersheds degraded, and rainfall patterns grew erratic. Reservoirs that once held a city's water supply for months could now run dry in weeks, while once manageable seasonal floods became destructive torrents that wiped out crops and city infrastructure. As if that weren't enough, climate data reveals the entire region was simultaneously hit by a series of severe, prolonged droughts. Tree ring studies from across Mesoamerica confirm that the 8th and 9th centuries experienced some of the driest conditions in more than 1,000 years. Environmental pressures that might have been manageable in the past became existential threats for cities that had already pushed their ecosystems to the breaking point. This agricultural crisis didn't hit everywhere at once. The impact varied from region to region, creating a complex patchwork of survival, migration, and conflict. Highland communities with more reliable water sources held on longer than lowland cities that depended entirely on their failing irrigation systems. Coastal settlements that could turn to the sea for food remained more stable than inland centers that relied solely on farming. These imbalances sparked new conflicts, as desperate and starving populations began to move, seeking refuge in more stable areas. The most visible sign of the crisis was the end of monument building. Across the Maya world, the construction of grand temples and stelae, the ultimate symbols of a king's power, ground to a halt in the late 8th century. At many great cities, the last dated monuments all cluster around this time, a silent testament to rulers who could no longer marshal the labor and resources for such projects. At Kapan, the magnificent hieroglyphic stairway was abandoned mid-construction, its intricate story ending in an unfinished sentence. At Palenque, a city famous for centuries of breathtaking architecture, all buildings simply stopped. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was an ideological one. The entire political system was based on the idea that kings were divine intermediaries who could ensure prosperity. When they could no longer commission magnificent public works or host elaborate ceremonies, their claims to cosmic favor began to ring hollow. The sacred calendars and astronomical predictions, once the bedrock of royal authority, became meaningless when rulers couldn't deliver on their promises. With the old sources of legitimacy gone, the infighting among the elite became even more savage. Palaces were transformed into fortresses, with defensive walls and guard towers hastily added to once-open courtyards. Royal courts that had been centers of art and science became armed camps, as factions fought over rapidly shrinking resources. As the chaos mounted, the population itself began to disappear. With widespread famine and violence making city life impossible, people fled in a mass exodus. Demographic studies suggest some of the largest cities lost up to 90% of their people in just a few generations. This wasn't a gradual decline, it was a demographic cliff. Entire urban centers, once home to tens of thousands, were left almost completely deserted within decades. Excavated homes show signs of this frantic departure, with pottery, tools, and other valuable items simply left behind as families ran for their lives. This great collapse created a mosaic of ruin and resilience. The southern lowlands, the heartland of the classic Maya civilization, suffered the most. Mighty centers like Kapan, Palenque, Tikal, and dozens of others were almost completely swallowed by the jungle by the 10th century. And yet, in the northern Yucatan, a different story was unfolding. Here, cities not only survived but showed remarkable resilience, setting the stage for a new chapter in Maya history. This new chapter was written not in the old heartlands, but in the northern reaches of the peninsula, where a new power was emerging from the ashes of the old order. While southern cities crumbled, Chichen Itza was actually in a period of expansion, its population swelling as it welcomed refugees fleeing the widespread instability. This shift in power, however, was born from a period of unprecedented crisis. The collapse itself wasn't a single, uniform event. Its timing and intensity varied greatly from one region to another. This patchwork of decline reveals the intricate web of environmental, social, and economic pressures that triggered the crisis. Survival often hinged on adaptability. Those cities that had cultivated diverse resources and flexible farming techniques outlasted those singularly dependent on intensive corn farming. Similarly, centers that kept their trade routes open could bring in vital goods when local supplies failed. Political agility was just as crucial, with more adaptable governments proving far more capable of navigating the chaos than those stuck in rigid, top-down systems. It's impossible to overstate the role that constant warfare played in speeding up this decline. As essential resources like food and water grew scarce, the competition between neighboring cities exploded into open conflict. Archaeological finds from the late Classic period paint a clear picture of this escalating paranoia, with cities increasingly building defensive walls, digging moats, and choosing strategic high-ground locations for protection. The delicate systems of diplomacy that once kept the peace completely fell apart, replaced by the desperate and aggressive survival strategies of besieged rulers. This wasn't just warfare for territory. It was a uniquely destructive campaign aimed at the very foundations of urban life. Advancing armies would intentionally demolish water management systems, torch agricultural fields, and tear down trade infrastructure. The ultimate objective was not simply to win a battle, but to completely erase a rival's ability to ever recover. This brutal, scorched-earth strategy transformed once thriving regions into vast, depopulated wastelands. The relentless cycle of military defeat and environmental catastrophe also had a profound psychological effect, shattering the core beliefs that had held classic civilization together for centuries. The entire concept of divine kingship rested on the idea that rulers could bargain with the gods to guarantee security and prosperity. But when kings repeatedly failed to stop famine, military losses, and social breakdown, the ideological basis of their authority simply disintegrated. With faith in their leaders gone, desperate populations began to turn on the very elites who could no longer deliver on their cosmic promises, leading to a rise in popular uprisings. In fact, some archaeological sites show evidence that peasant revolts may have been the final blow for several major cities. The signs of destruction in elite palaces and homes looked different from typical battle damage, suggesting the attackers came from within the city walls, not from a rival army. Looters specifically targeted and destroyed luxury goods, while leaving everyday utilitarian items alone, a clear indication of focused violence against the symbols of elite power. Another pillar of classic civilization crumbled with the collapse of specialized craft production. In a world now obsessed with basic survival, the skills of master artisans who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of working with jade and obsidian became virtually meaningless. The vibrant workshops that once produced stunning works of art were left abandoned as their wealthy patrons vanished and their creations lost all cultural relevance. Religion also shifted to reflect this new reality of constant crisis. To prove their dwindling connection to the divine, rulers performed bloodletting rituals with greater frequency and intensity. Even human sacrifice, though never as widespread as later stereotypes would have you believe, seems to have increased as communities desperately sought supernatural aid for their growing list of problems. Mass burials discovered at several sites may even be evidence of sacrificial offerings made to pacify angry gods. The great intellectual traditions of the classic period, mathematics, astronomy, writing, also faded away along with the elite court culture that had nurtured them. What was the point of complex calendar calculations when there were no more royal ceremonies to plan? Why track the stars when there were no kings whose rule needed cosmic validation? The sophisticated hieroglyphic system, once used to record royal histories, fell into disuse as the very dynasties it celebrated were swallowed by the jungle. However, this collapse was neither universal nor instantaneous. While the southern lowlands were emptying out, new forms of civilization were already budding in the north. The magnificent southern metropolises did not vanish in a single cataclysm. Instead, they faded slowly, as generation after generation gave up hope of ever restoring them to their former glory. For centuries after their peak, some centers were home to small caretaker communities who maintained the most sacred temples and performed simplified rituals. But by the year 900, the spectacular urban civilization that had defined Mesoamerica for over 600 years was, for all intents and purposes, gone. To this day, scholars debate the exact causes, with theories pointing to everything from environmental ruin and climate change to warfare, social revolution, and economic failure. The truth is likely a combination of all these things, a perfect storm where manageable stresses compounded one another, creating a cascade of failures that ultimately overwhelmed society's ability to adapt. The legacy of this great collapse would echo for centuries, shaping the future of Mesoamerican civilization. The northern centers that endured forged new, more resilient political systems, though they lacked the sheer grandeur of their classic predecessors. Meanwhile, the memory of the great southern cities passed into legend, becoming both an inspiration and a cautionary tale about the perils of environmental hubris and political rigidity. Ultimately, the story of the classic Maya collapse is one of history's most stark reminders of how even the most advanced societies are bound by ecological limits. The kings who claimed the power of the gods found they could not command the fundamental forces of nature that sustain human life. As jungle vines crept over their silent palaces, a new force was gathering strength in the north. This was Chichen Itza, and its rise marked not just a continuation of the old ways, but the dawn of something completely new, a revolutionary fusion of local tradition and foreign influence that would redefine the culture of the entire region. Though the site itself was ancient, with ceremonial buildings dating as far back as the 6th century, the Chichen Itza that came to dominate the post-classic world was an entirely new creation. It was built by migrants who introduced architectural styles, religious beliefs, and political ideas previously unseen in the Maya world. These newcomers, known as the Itza, were a hybridized people, claiming a lineage that traced back to both local Maya dynasties and the powerful Toltec kingdoms of distant central Mexico. This unique heritage made them remarkably adaptable. Their migration sagas, recorded in later chronicles, tell of a people guided by prophecy on a quest for a new northern homeland. Led by the mythic figure Kukulkan, the feathered serpent, they supposedly traveled from the highlands of Mexico, carrying with them radical new concepts about society and the cosmos. Whether these tales are literal history or a mythological charter for their rule is still debated, but their transformative impact on the region is undeniable. The perfect symbol of this new era is El Castillo, the iconic step pyramid that stands at the heart of the city's Great Plaza. Its very design is a blend of traditional Maya building methods and innovative Toltec aesthetics. The entire structure is also a masterfully engineered solar calendar, where shadows create a stunning visual effect during the equinoxes. While this grand structure served as a masterfully engineered solar calendar, its architectural theater was a sophisticated demonstration of deep astronomical knowledge. During the spring and autumn equinoxes, an illusion is formed by the shadows cast from the pyramid's edges, creating the spectacle of a massive serpent slithering down the northern staircase. Nearby, the great ball court at Chichen Itza completely dwarfs any counterpart from earlier periods. This arena stretches for more than 500 feet in length and is flanked by imposing walls that rise 30 feet above the playing field. The acoustics of the court were engineered with astonishing sophistication. A whisper from one end can be heard perfectly at the other, and a single handclap generates a series of echoes that sound like the cry of the sacred Quetzal bird. More than a simple athletic venue, this was a cosmic stage where ritual games dramatized the fundamental conflict between chaos and order. Over time, the ball game itself transformed into an increasingly intricate ritual performance. The players, often adorned as gods or mythological figures, were not merely competing for a win, but were battling for the very continuation of the cosmic cycle. The rubber ball was a symbol for the sun, and its successful passage across the court was believed to guarantee the sun's own journey through the sky. The most significant of these games culminated in human sacrifice, although evidence indicates the victims were frequently volunteers who considered their death a divine transformation, not a punishment. Religious innovation also achieved extraordinary new heights, with Chichen Itza fostering new modes of worship that blended traditional Maya beliefs with outside influences. A prime example of this synthesis is the Temple of the Warriors, where columns carved in the likeness of plumed serpents support a structure honoring both ancient rain gods and the increasingly important feathered serpent deity. Murals inside depict elaborate ceremonies that feature familiar bloodletting rituals alongside new types of offerings that show Toltec religious influences. The area's natural sinkholes, or cenotes, which are filled with water, became central locations for progressively complex sacrificial rites. Over several centuries, thousands of offerings were cast into the depths of the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. These included gold discs, jade jewelry, incense burners, and even human remains. The discovery of these underwater artifacts reveals the truly international scope of the city's power, as some objects came from as far away as modern-day Panama and Colombia. These cenote sacrifices were less about desperate pleas to angry gods and more about meticulously planned ceremonies that showcased a ruler's power to acquire resources from the entire known world. During this era, maritime trade networks underwent a dramatic expansion, linking the northern peninsula to distant lands in a way that land-based travel never could. Coastal settlements grew into major ports that processed goods from across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Massive seagoing canoes, some capable of holding several tons of cargo, regularly traveled routes connecting the peninsula to regions that are now Honduras, Belize, and the islands of the Caribbean. The economic strength of the northern Maya was built on the control of several vital resources. Salt production, centered along the northern coast, supplied a crucial commodity for trade and food preservation. The region's shallow lagoons were ideally suited for solar evaporation, a method that yielded high-quality salt crystals desired throughout Mesoamerica. In the northern climate, cotton farming also prospered, fueling a textile industry that created everything from everyday cloth to luxurious fabrics adorned with vibrant dyes and intricate designs. Cacao, however, continued to be the most valuable trade good, and northern merchants managed distribution chains that extended from Pacific coast plantations to highland marketplaces. The cacao beans were not just a luxury food, they also functioned as a standardized currency, enabling complex business deals across enormous distances. Northern Maya traders even established sophisticated credit systems and business partnerships, which allowed them to fund expeditions and manage warehouses in far-off markets. South of the northern plains, the Puuc Hills became the heartland of a unique architectural style that, while not as grand in scale, rivaled Chichen Itza in its complexity. Sites like Uxmal, Kaba, and Sail are home to ornate palaces and temples distinguished by their elaborate stone mosaics and inventive engineering. At Uxmal, the Palace of the Governors displays an incredible grasp of astronomy, with its main facade precisely aligned to track the southernmost rising point of Venus over its 8-year cycle. Architectural innovation soared as northern Maya builders explored construction methods that were unknown in the southern lowlands. The use of concrete cores in walls permitted the creation of larger interior rooms and more ambitious structural designs. Decorative stone mosaics were crafted with an unprecedented level of artistry, with each piece individually carved to interlock like parts of a three-dimensional puzzle. The iconic facades of Puuc buildings showcase detailed geometric patterns interwoven with carvings of gods, animals, and mythological events, all requiring immense skill to produce. As northern communities adapted to their environment-specific challenges, their water management systems grew increasingly advanced. The northern peninsula lacked the rivers and lakes of the southern regions, making it completely reliant on groundwater accessed via cenotes and man-made wells. Engineers created intricate systems of underground channels and chultuns, which were bell-shaped cisterns, that connected natural water sources to city centers and efficiently collected and stored rainwater. The political system that developed in the north was also markedly different from the divine kingship common in the southern cities. While leaders still asserted a connection to the supernatural, authority was more often shared among councils of nobles, powerful merchant families, and regional governors. This more distributed power structure turned out to be far more resilient than the centralized dynasties of the South, enabling northern society to adjust more readily to new challenges. The era's artistic accomplishments represent the pinnacle of this cultural synthesis. At Chichen Itza, sculptors crafted monuments that masterfully wove together artistic traditions from different regions and historical periods. The well-known Calakmul sculptures, reclining figures that hold offering bowls on their stomachs, are a completely original artistic form that went on to influence Mesoamerican art for generations. These statues acted as intermediaries between human devotees and the gods, their placement carefully designed to channel offerings from the earthly realm to the supernatural one. The intellectual heritage that had thrived in the south was given new life in the north. Astronomical observation was still carried out with incredible accuracy, but its purpose shifted from validating the power of individual kings to preserving cosmic balance for the entire community. Likewise, calendar keeping evolved from a royal duty into a communal one, with teams of specialists collaborating to maintain precise timekeeping and the correct scheduling of ceremonies. The Northern Renaissance was characterized by rich regional variations that mirrored the diverse cultural currents of the period. Coastal towns fostered distinct maritime cultures, while communities further inland perfected new agricultural techniques. Highland areas kept stronger ties to southern traditions, whereas lowland cities pursued more radical forms of cultural fusion. This variety resulted in a vibrant cultural landscape, where different communities could specialize in certain trades while staying interconnected through commerce and shared religious beliefs. The dominance of Chichen Itza was more than just a political shift. It signaled the rise of a new blueprint for Mesoamerican society. This model, defined by the integration of diverse cultures, an emphasis on sea trade, and more adaptable political systems, would shape the region's trajectory for centuries. This northern renaissance proved that profound cultural innovation could arise from what seemed like a period of decline, turning crisis into an opportunity for creative adaptation and synthesis. However, just as Chichen Itza was reaching its peak of power and influence in the 11th century, internal pressures began to mount that would ultimately threaten its supremacy. The very cultural diversity that had fueled its strength also sparked conflicts between factions as various groups vied for control. The vast trade networks that generated such wealth also forged dependencies that were vulnerable to disruption by outside forces. The innovative political arrangements that had at first been so effective were starting to create new kinds of instability, setting the stage for yet another major transformation of the region's cultural map. The mysterious abandonment of Chichen Itza around the year 1200 left a power vacuum that would once again reshape Mesoamerica's political geography. As the great northern capital fell into silence, its incredible structures slowly consumed by the jungle, new powers rose to take its place. The era that dawned was defined not by the centralized authority of a single metropolis, but by the emergence of confederations that spread power across multiple competing centers. Mayapan rose as the most prominent successor, positioning itself as the head of what is now called the League of Mayapan. This new political arrangement was a radical break from previous governance models, uniting dozens of formerly independent cities into a loose alliance held together by tribute payments, trade pacts, and common religious rituals. The system was remarkably stable, maintaining peace across the northern peninsula for more than 200 years. The capital city itself was a reflection of this new political order. In contrast to the monumental buildings of earlier cities, Mayapan's structures were smaller but far more numerous, providing housing for delegates from allied communities who lived permanently in the Confederate capital. The city served as both an administrative headquarters and a diplomatic center, where representatives gathered to settle disputes, plan military actions, and stage large-scale ceremonies that strengthened their shared identity. Within this confederacy, political power was distributed among several institutions, instead of being held by a single divine king. While the Kakam family held a hereditary leadership role, their authority was counterbalanced by councils that represented merchant guilds, military orders, and provincial governors. This intricate system of checks and balances stopped any one group from gaining too much power and guaranteed that various interest groups had a voice in the Confederation's decisions. During this same period, the Highland regions developed their own unique political systems, with powerful city-states like Cuyumarcaj and Iximch controlling the mountainous lands of present-day Guatemala. These highland kingdoms had much stronger ties to central Mexican cultures than their lowland neighbors did. They adopted military technologies and political structures from Toltec and later Aztec civilizations, which led to the development of a more militarized society where warrior elites held key roles in government and religious life. The architecture in the highlands mirrored these cultural leanings, featuring fortress-like compounds constructed on defensible terrain. This focus on defensibility shaped the very layout of their communities, which were built on fortified hilltops instead of the wide-open plazas common in lowland areas. A clear emphasis on military readiness could be seen in the construction of enormous defensive walls, the clever placement of watchtowers, and the design of residential zones meant to survive a siege. These structures were more than just practical defenses. They were declarations of strength, announcing their creators' ability to protect their lands from any threat. The economic engines that powered post-classic society were far more varied and durable than in previous eras. Instead of relying mostly on agricultural surplus and the consumption of luxuries by the elite, communities established specialized industries to meet both local demands and the needs of long-distance trade. Settlements along the coast centered on producing salt and gathering marine resources. In the highlands, communities became experts in obsidian toolmaking and textile weaving, whereas lowland regions focused on growing cacao and harvesting forest products. Marketplaces grew increasingly complex, with standardized forms of currency and commercial laws that made intricate transactions possible across huge distances. Cacao beans continued to be the main form of currency, but they were joined by cotton textiles, copper bells, and jade jewelry, each serving distinct roles in various commercial exchanges. A professional class of merchants appeared, complete with their own guilds, established trade routes, and special diplomatic rights that let them move freely across political borders. Cultural life also changed, adapting to new political circumstances while staying true to ancestral beliefs. Religious rituals shifted to be more centered on the community and less on individual kings, although their core purpose of preserving cosmic balance and social unity remained. The worship of the revered feathered serpent deity was still a major part of ceremonial life, but it was now overseen by colleges of priests rather than royal courts. In some places, ritual activities grew more intense as people tried to secure divine favor in times of political instability. While not as widespread as later Spanish accounts claimed, human sacrifice seems to have become more frequent and elaborate during certain times. Archaeological findings at sites like Mayapan reveal dedicated sacrificial platforms where prisoners of war were offered to the gods to secure victory in battle and bountiful harvests. Bloodletting rites were still fundamental to religious life, but they were no longer exclusive to royalty. Elite families across the confederacies held the right to conduct these rituals, and there is evidence that even community leaders who were not nobles sometimes took part in simpler forms of these ancient ceremonies. This wider participation was crucial for maintaining cultural traditions while fitting them into new social frameworks. The ball game retained its vital social and religious importance, but its administration changed to match the new political order. Instead of large, single courts for royal events, communities constructed numerous smaller courts. These venues hosted regular games between different neighborhoods, professional guilds, and teams from other towns. The games were a source of both entertainment and diplomacy, offering a space to settle disagreements and forge alliances between communities. During this era, highland and lowland societies developed increasingly separate cultural identities. Lowland peoples kept stronger ties to their maritime heritage and had more egalitarian social systems. In contrast, highland groups adopted more hierarchical, military-focused structures and incorporated religious beliefs from central Mexico. These regional differences wove together a rich cultural tapestry, where various areas cultivated unique traditions while staying interconnected through commerce and a common ancestry. The position of women in post-classic society seems to have grown beyond their traditional roles of earlier times. Archaeological discoveries indicate that female merchants were significant figures in long-distance trade. At the same time, noblewomen maintained considerable political power through strategic marriages and inheritance. It is possible that some communities even had female rulers, although the evidence for this is sparse and open to interpretation. Intellectual life adapted to support more decentralized political structures. The practices of calendar keeping and astronomical observation were maintained with incredible accuracy. However, this knowledge was now held by professional specialists who worked for entire confederations, not just for a single ruler. Scribal schools produced bureaucrats who could handle the complex administrative needs of political unions spanning multiple communities. The writing system became somewhat simpler in this period, placing less importance on the detailed historical accounts seen on royal monuments and more on practical records for government and business. The use of books made from bark paper became more prevalent as literacy extended beyond the royal court to merchant families and professional administrators who required written records for their work. Technological progress continued, even with the political turbulence of the time. Highland communities created new methods for working with copper and bronze, producing tools and ornaments that were a major leap forward from older technologies. In the lowlands, settlements tested better farming methods, such as raised field systems that could generate greater harvests with a smaller environmental footprint. The military tactics and technologies that first appeared late in the southern conflicts were refined and organized during the Postclassic period. Professional warrior classes emerged with standardized gear and training regimens, making the armies of the confederacies more formidable than the loosely organized forces of the past. New tactical possibilities opened up with the arrival of the bow and arrow from central Mexico, which altered the very nature of warfare in the region. Regional trade networks grew to a level of sophistication never seen before, as expert merchants forged commercial ties that stretched from central Mexico down to lower Central America. Obsidian from the highlands found its way to Caribbean coastal towns, while cacao and cotton from the lowlands were traded throughout the mountainous interiors. These extensive commercial links helped preserve a sense of cultural unity even as political structures fragmented. Religious pilgrimages also became a vital institution, linking diverse communities through common spiritual journeys. Sacred locations, such as the cenotes of the northern peninsula, drew pilgrims from all over the region, which in turn fostered cultural exchange and diplomatic relations outside of formal politics. These pilgrimage routes reinforced a shared identity in the absence of a single, unifying political power. The dawn of the 16th century saw increasing, though at first indirect, contact with European influences. Spanish voyages along the Caribbean coast brought new diseases and technologies that started to impact indigenous societies long before any direct attempts at conquest. The political adaptability that had defined post-classic society would be both a strength and a weakness when facing these new, unparalleled challenges. As 1511 drew near, a Spanish shipwreck would bring the first Europeans into direct, sustained contact with the societies of the Americas. The survivors of this maritime catastrophe were thrown into a cultural encounter that would forever change the course of the region's history. The political systems, economic networks, and cultural traditions that had developed over the post-classic period were about to face their ultimate challenge, as two profoundly different worlds collided in a way neither could have predicted. This encounter began not with an invasion, but with a struggle for survival. In 1511, a Spanish vessel traveling from Panama to Santo Domingo wrecked on the dangerous reefs off the Yucatan Peninsula's eastern shore. Of the 20 people who made it to land, most died within a few months from sickness, hunger, or ritual sacrifice. Two men, Gonzalo Guerrero and Geronimo de Aguilar, survived and lived among indigenous communities for 8 years, becoming the first Europeans to see American society from the inside. Their experiences highlight the intricate nature of the cultural contact that would define the following century. Aguilar held onto his Christian faith and Spanish identity, learning local languages and customs to position himself as a bridge between the two worlds. Guerrero took a different route entirely. He married into a noble family, adopted local clothing and traditions, and eventually became a military leader fighting against Spanish incursions. Their contrasting decisions foreshadowed the wide array of responses that would arise as European and American cultures met. When Hernán Cortés arrived on the Yucatan coast in 1519, he was not looking for a fight, but for supplies and information on his way to the legendary wealth of central Mexico. His expedition's brief meetings with coastal peoples gave the Spanish their first organized intelligence on American political structures, religious beliefs, and material culture. These initial interactions were defined more by shared curiosity than aggression, as each side tried to make sense of the unfamiliar foreigners they had met. The devastation of European diseases arrived years before the conquerors themselves, triggering a demographic disaster that completely shifted the balance of power among indigenous groups. Smallpox, measles, and typhus tore through populations with no natural immunity to these old-world illnesses. In some areas, death rates soared to 90%, wiping out communities and shattering the political systems that had ensured stability for centuries. The magnitude of this biological catastrophe is hard to comprehend. It was the single greatest population collapse in all of human history. Francisco de Montijo, the elder, obtained a royal charter to conquer the Yucatan in 1526. This launched a campaign that would stretch for more than 20 years and require 3 separate expeditions to gain even a partial victory. His first forays were spectacular failures. Spanish forces were defeated time and again by indigenous armies that had adopted European military tech while leveraging their own tactical strengths. The thick jungle, guerrilla warfare, and punishing climate were far greater obstacles than the open plains, where Spanish cavalry and firearms had been so successful in central Mexico. The first Montijo expedition, from 1527 to 1528, managed to set up some temporary bases on the east coast, but was unable to push inland against determined opposition. Indigenous warriors had quickly figured out how to neutralize Spanish advantages, avoiding pitched battles and instead waging a constant war of attrition that made permanent settlement impossible. The expedition fell apart after its supply lines from Cuba were cut, leaving the Spanish isolated in hostile lands. Montijo's second invasion, from 1531 to 1535, came from the west coast, where he founded the town of Campeche as a launchpad for inland campaigns. This effort saw more early success, as Spanish troops advanced into the interior and made alliances with some native groups who saw them as allies against their old rivals. However, a massive, coordinated uprising ultimately drove the Spanish out of most of their newly won territory, forcing them back to their coastal forts. The final campaign, from 1540 to 1546, was successful only because the demographic collapse had profoundly changed the military situation. Disease had decimated indigenous populations, leaving them unable to mount an effective defense. Meanwhile, Spanish reinforcements and native allies gave them the manpower needed for a systematic conquest. The founding of Mérida in 1542 signaled the start of lasting European rule over the northern peninsula, although vast territories remained outside of direct Spanish control. Indigenous reactions to the conquest were incredibly varied, differing from region to region and community to community. Some groups, especially those who had been subject to more powerful neighbors, at first saw the Spanish as a chance to upend the old order. Others, particularly the highland kingdoms of Guatemala, put up a ferocious fight that took decades to quell. The most effective indigenous strategies blended diplomatic shrewdness with military tenacity, which allowed communities to negotiate better terms while preserving their cultural independence. The Guatemalan highlands posed a different set of challenges for the Spanish than the Yucatan. The Kayich, kingdom of Cuyumarcaj, led a confederation of allied towns that could muster large armies with advanced weaponry and defensive structures. Pedro de Alvarado's conquest of this area, from 1524 to 1540, was a grueling series of campaigns against numerous strongholds, each defended by people fighting for their political and cultural existence. The siege of Cuyumarcaj in 1524 was a stark display of both the military power and the cultural ruthlessness of the Spanish conquest. After seizing the capital through a deceptive ploy, Spanish forces razed the city and executed its leaders, delivering a clear message that any resistance would be met with annihilation. But the fall of the capital did not break the highland resistance, which carried on for decades through guerrilla warfare. Far to the south, nestled in the lakes and jungles of the Petén region, the kingdom of Teazal remained completely independent for nearly 2 centuries after the initial Spanish invasion. Shielded by treacherous terrain and strong, unified leadership, this community fought off all attempts at conquest until 1697. That year, Spanish forces finally took the island capital after a siege that went on for several months. The fall of Teazal represented the end of the last sovereign indigenous kingdom in the Americas. The tactics the Itza used to preserve their freedom offer a window into the factors that decided success or failure in the face of European conquest. The story of how indigenous communities endured centuries of systematic oppression is truly one of history's most incredible tales of persistence. By examining the strategies they used to preserve their identity while adapting to ever-changing circumstances, we gain priceless insights into the very nature of cultural change and resistance. Most importantly, their continued existence today ensures that the profound achievements of their pre-conquest ancestors are not just archaeological curiosities, but a vibrant part of our contemporary world. Every single morning, 6 million people in Guatemala, Belize, Mexico, and Honduras start their day speaking languages that have echoed through millennia of uninterrupted cultural history. These are the living descendants of the people who constructed the Great Pyramids and the direct heirs to an astronomical knowledge that tracked the cycles of the heavens with mathematical precision. They are the keepers of agricultural traditions that once sustained massive urban populations in challenging tropical environments. Their very presence today represents one of the greatest stories of cultural survival against truly overwhelming odds. Modern communities have powerfully transformed the survival tactics developed during centuries of colonial oppression, using them as the foundation for a cultural renaissance. The stunning linguistic diversity that Spanish authorities once tried to stamp out has now become a source of immense ethnic pride and a tool for political mobilization. More than 30 distinct languages continue to be spoken, with each one representing a unique perspective on the relationship between humanity, the natural world, and the supernatural, all evolved over thousands of years. Guatemala is home to the largest indigenous population in the Americas, with communities that skillfully maintain their traditional practices while fully engaging with modern political and economic systems. The highlands retain a predominantly indigenous character, where market towns function as dynamic cultural hubs. Here, ancient weaving traditions produce brilliant textiles that combine pre-conquest designs with contemporary innovations. These markets are far more than simple commercial exchanges. They are vital cultural institutions where traditional knowledge is passed down through the generations. Educational movements have seen remarkable success in promoting literacy in indigenous languages, while also making sure younger generations gain the Spanish or English skills needed to participate in national economies. Across the region, bilingual schools are now operating, teaching modern curricula right alongside traditional knowledge. These educational innovations are a sophisticated response to the pressures of globalization, designed to maintain cultural distinctiveness while enabling economic progress. A powerful resurgence in indigenous political participation has reshaped national politics throughout the region. Indigenous candidates in Guatemala have won significant elections at both local and national levels, while constitutional reforms in Mexico now recognize the collective rights of indigenous communities. These political victories are the result of decades of organizing that masterfully blended traditional leadership structures with modern advocacy methods. Women have been especially crucial figures in these contemporary cultural revival movements, frequently acting as the primary guardians and transmitters of traditional languages, craft techniques, and religious practices. Indigenous women's organizations have been highly successful in advocating for both cultural preservation and gender equality, proving that these two goals can powerfully reinforce each other. Traditional medical systems are still serving large populations, and they are increasingly earning recognition from mainstream healthcare institutions. Indigenous healers possess a sophisticated understanding of medicinal plants and therapeutic techniques that work to complement modern medicine rather than compete with it. In fact, research partnerships between traditional healers and university scientists have led to important new breakthroughs in drug development and treatment strategies. Agricultural practices that were perfected over millennia offer sustainable and viable alternatives to industrial farming methods, which have often proven to be environmentally destructive. By using traditional polyculture systems that integrate multiple crops in complex rotations, communities maintain the fertility of their soil and produce diverse harvests that guarantee food security. These methods are now attracting growing interest from environmental scientists who are searching for solutions to biodiversity loss and climate change. Religious traditions show an amazing degree of continuity. Despite centuries of Christian evangelization, contemporary ceremonies often weave in Catholic elements while still retaining their essential indigenous character. This creates syncretic practices that fulfill traditional spiritual needs as well as important social functions for the community. Sacred sites continue to be destinations for pilgrims from across the region, upholding cultural connections that easily transcend modern national borders. The famous 2012 phenomenon became an unforeseen chance for global cultural education, as media from around the world suddenly focused on indigenous calendar systems and cosmological beliefs. Instead of predicting the end of the world, traditional knowledge holders explained that 2012 simply marked the end of a major calendrical cycle and the start of a new era for human consciousness. This worldwide attention provided a platform for indigenous voices that had long been excluded from international conversations. The rise of archaeological tourism presents both fresh opportunities and new challenges for contemporary communities. While major sites like Chichen Itza, Tikal, and Palenque attract millions of visitors each year, bringing jobs and economic growth to largely indigenous regions, this industry also creates pressure to commercialize culture, which can distort authentic practices for outside consumption. In response, many communities have developed thoughtful approaches to tourism that preserve cultural authenticity while still generating economic benefits. Community-based initiatives give visitors a chance to experience modern indigenous life, while also ensuring that the revenue directly supports local development goals. These programs often have an educational focus, teaching visitors about living cultural traditions rather than just the archaeological ruins. Language revitalization efforts are achieving incredible success, even with ongoing pressures toward assimilation. New digital technologies offer powerful tools for documenting and passing on traditional languages, and social media platforms help speakers from different communities stay connected and coordinate their preservation work. Younger generations are increasingly seeing multilingual ability as a valuable asset rather than a liability. Contemporary art movements are creating groundbreaking expressions that convey indigenous perspectives to both local and global audiences by combining traditional techniques with modern themes and materials. Painters, writers, sculptors, and musicians are drawing on ancestral traditions for inspiration while tackling current social and political issues. This artistic innovation highlights the dynamic nature of living cultures, which continue to evolve while holding on to their essential character. Political activism has led to significant legal victories that not only protect indigenous rights, but also set important precedents for other minority groups worldwide. Several countries now have constitutional reforms that recognize indigenous languages as official, protect collective land ownership, and guarantee cultural autonomy in local governance and education. Decades of organizing, combining traditional consensus building with modern advocacy, were required to achieve these legal milestones. Environmental protection movements are increasingly viewing indigenous communities as indispensable allies in conservation. Traditional ecological knowledge offers deep insights into sustainable resource management that beautifully complement scientific methods. Because indigenous territories often contain the most biodiverse ecosystems in the region, community-based conservation has become essential for preserving ecological balance. International recognition of indigenous rights has opened new doors for political advocacy and cultural preservation. Communities can now use legal frameworks like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to defend their territories and cultural practices. This global attention also helps attract resources for development projects that put community needs first, rather than prioritizing external economic interests. Still, contemporary challenges persist, including ongoing discrimination, economic marginalization, and environmental threats that have a disproportionate impact on indigenous communities. Traditional agricultural systems are threatened by climate change, while large-scale development projects often endanger sacred sites and the natural resources vital for cultural practices. Overcoming these hurdles will demand sustained political action and creative new strategies for adaptation. Economic development projects are increasingly focusing on approaches that build upon traditional strengths instead of replacing them with outside models. Sustainable agriculture programs, ecotourism projects, and craft cooperatives are generating income while also preserving cultural practices that might otherwise vanish under economic pressure. These initiatives prove that economic development and cultural preservation can be mutually supportive goals. The achievements in education have been especially impressive. A growing number of indigenous students are completing university degrees while staying deeply connected to their home communities. Today, indigenous professionals are working in fields from law and medicine to computer science and engineering, often applying traditional perspectives to solve modern professional problems. The continued practice of traditional calendar keeping shows just how relevant ancient knowledge systems remain in the modern world. Community leaders still rely on traditional calendars to schedule major ceremonies and key agricultural activities, maintaining timing systems that have proven effective for thousands of years. These practices demonstrate a sophisticated grasp of natural cycles that is incredibly valuable in our era of environmental instability. Cultural festivals and ceremonies continue to perform essential social roles while adapting to contemporary life. It's now common for traditional celebrations to include modern touches like sound systems and video recording, all while maintaining their core spiritual and social significance. These adaptations reveal the dynamic nature of living traditions that evolve without losing their essential characteristics. Collaborative research between indigenous communities and academic institutions has led to major innovations in fields from agriculture and environmental science to mathematics and astronomy. These partnerships often show that traditional knowledge systems hold sophisticated insights that complement modern scientific methods. Such collaborations also help ensure that the communities who share their knowledge are the ones who benefit from the research. The global indigenous rights movement has created platforms for sharing strategies and building solidarity across different cultures. Leaders from various continents can learn from one another's successes and struggles while celebrating the distinct characteristics that make their own cultures unique. This international collaboration strengthens local movements and contributes to a worldwide effort for social justice and environmental stewardship. Digital technologies are unlocking new possibilities for cultural preservation and transmission that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. Thousands of hours of traditional music, ceremonial recordings, and stories are now stored in online archives, ensuring this cultural knowledge is safe for future generations. Social media platforms also allow young people to foster cultural connections even when they live far from their ancestral lands. The 21st century is witnessing an unprecedented wave of indigenous cultural revival and political mobilization across the Americas. Communities that were once predicted to simply assimilate and disappear have instead found new levels of cultural vitality and political recognition. This modern renaissance proves that globalization doesn't have to lead to cultural uniformity, especially when communities have the determination and resources to protect their unique traditions. Looking ahead, indigenous communities face both significant challenges and incredible opportunities that will define their path for generations. While climate change poses a threat to traditional ways of life, it also creates a chance for communities with deep environmental knowledge to contribute to global sustainability. Likewise, educational success allows for greater political influence, but also creates pressures for cultural adaptation that must be managed with care. The story that started with the first cultivation of maize in the Highland Valleys is still being told today. It continues in the voices of children learning their traditional languages, in the hands of weavers carrying ancient designs into the modern world, and in the ceremonies that uphold relationships with the natural and supernatural forces that have sustained these communities for millennia. Time remains unbroken, flowing from the past through the present and into a future that will be shaped by the same creative adaptability that allowed them to survive every previous challenge. The incredible persistence of indigenous cultures through centuries of oppression offers hope for a world that values cultural diversity in our increasingly globalized age. Their success proves that human societies can engage with larger political and economic systems while still holding onto their distinctive character. Most importantly, their continued presence ensures that the amazing artistic and intellectual legacies of pre-conquest societies remain living traditions, contributing to human knowledge today while pointing toward a future that honors both innovation and tradition. The calendar turns, the ceremonies continue, and the story flows onward, unbroken through time.